morning and good afternoon to in-house counsel and in-house legal professionals from all across North America and the world. Welcome to In-House Connect. My name is Shai Mahani. I'm the CEO and co-founder of In-House Connect, and I'm thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you for spending your breakfast time or your lunchtime with us, and special thanks to our wonderful sponsor, SpotDraft, and our rock star panel today, featuring Mark Kahn, Meg Kammerud Eleanor Lacey, and Akshay Verma, who are going to engage in a lively, fun discussion about who should the GC report to is a hot button topic. What are the pros and cons? What are the scenarios where it makes sense or it doesn't make sense? This is our 74th webinar of the year, and I'm wondering, are you here for the first time or have you tuned into an IHC webinar before? I'm thrilled to welcome back Akshay Verma and, of course, the rest of our panel, but Akshay is going to be leading the discussion and moderating. Akshay is the current COO of SpotDraft. As a recovering lawyer, Akshay spent 7 years practicing in the environmental field before transitioning into a legal consulting and business development role at Axiom. He spent another 7 years at Axiom helping large legal departments strategize on a variety of issues around resourcing, spending, technology implementation, and process improvement. Akshay also spent the last 5 years heading up the legal operations function at tech giants Meta and Coinbase, where much of his work involved leveraging process improvement and technology implementation to create efficiencies within the legal department. We had a wonderful pre-call yesterday, and I'm just really excited to hear our panel's thoughts on this wonderful topic. So Akshay, welcome back to In-House Connect.
Thanks so much, Shai. We moved pretty quickly after what I think everyone has seen on LinkedIn in terms of the energy around this topic to set this up and pull some experts together. So I'm going to turn it over to each one of them to do a quick intro. And I think as part of the introduction, I'd love to hear from each of you, Eleanor, Mark, and Meg, around some particular reporting lines that you've had as part of your introduction in let's say, maybe the last 10, 15 years of your career. So Meg, let's please start with you.
Hey, everybody. I'm Meg Kammerud. I am a partner at Kammerud DeMuzio and a fractional general counsel to a number of growing startups and advisor to some other ones. Prior to that, I was general counsel of 2 companies as they moved from the sort of Series C stage up through the unicorn stage, and for one, a billion-dollar acquisition. And in both of those companies, I reported to the CEO and was a member of the executive team along the line, had some discussions about our CEOs having too many direct reports and what it might look like to report to somebody else. So I've had those discussions. I'm going to put it out there. I won those discussions based on my opinion, but happy to be here and to have a talk with the rest of our panel. I think yesterday Eleanor used the word spicy. It might get spicy, so I'm excited about that.
Thanks, Meg. Mark?
Yeah, so I'm Mark Kahn. I am the general counsel for the Oakland Ballers minor league baseball team. I report to the CEO, but that's not a great example because our organization is like 15 people. And I spend most of my time doing non-legal stuff. Not illegal stuff, but non-legal. Prior to that, I spent a couple of years in executive recruiting, conversations with lots of CEOs and CFOs in some cases about legal hires. Before that, I was the general counsel at Segment, where it was interesting. I started off as head of legal, reporting to the CEO, then became head of legal, reporting to the CFO, and then was GC reporting to the CFO. I've seen it all over the place at other places where I wasn't the GC, but where the GC, like when I was at WhatsApp, the GC reported. Prior to the acquisition, the GC reported to the CEO.
Thanks,
All
Mark.
right.
Eleanor?
So I'm Eleanor Lacey. I'm the general counsel at Asana. I've been a GC since 1999, and I was looking through my history to remember who I reported to where. I reported both to the I've reported to the CFO, I've reported to the COO, and I've reported to the CEO at various companies. And I think it's relatively, or I think of it as relatively unusual that I reported into anybody other than the CEO at a publicly traded company. But there were some nuances to that. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today are what are the nuances when who you report to, and then what I want to talk about also is what's your title and where is your comp related to all of that. But right now I report to the CEO. My last company, I also reported to the CEO. But the company before that, SurveyMonkey, I reported to, he had a different title, but I would call him the COO, and then changed to reporting to the CEO later.
All right. Thank you all for that introduction. I talked a little bit about kind of how this topic has come to the forefront of so much of the conversation, predominantly on LinkedIn, although I don't think it's limited to LinkedIn whatsoever. And as Eleanor mentioned, our hope today, and maybe we'll have some specific outcomes that we advocate for in the conversation, but really, you have three people here who have seen and done quite a bit. They've been in different reporting structures. So as we get into some of the nuances, to use Eleanor's word, around reporting structures and the pros and cons of each, the hope at least is that for folks who are in a GC role now, or any aspiring GCs, that you have some takeaways to navigate these situations. Undoubtedly, you're going to come up against them in your career, particularly if you're headed in this direction and you want to head in this direction to be the lead lawyer at a company of any size. And I think we'll talk a little bit about company size and how that matters as well. But the hope is that you have some specific takeaways in terms of navigating those situations. So a couple of things, very, very emotionally charged topic, I think, as we have seen from the reactions and comments on social media. We will do our best to keep up with some of those comments in the chat. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. If I happen to kind of see them and they're relevant in the moment, I'll grab them then. Otherwise, we'll try and hit some of them towards the tail end of the conversation. So let's start off with really the main question, and we'll get into the nuances because I think it's a good way for the conversation to flow. And Eleanor, we'll start with you. Are you a hard no from a rule standpoint of report for the GC to report to a non-CEO executive, or are you more of a maybe and it depends?
I'm a maybe and it depends. I'll say I certainly have a preference for reporting to the CEO, and we can talk a little bit about that. But what I care about most is, what is my title? Because that's where my comp is going to be looked at with Radford and other things. Who are my peers? So where do I really sit in the company, regardless of who I'm reporting to? Am I an executive? There's often different levels of executives in a company. Where am I in that leveling? And what is my relationship to the board? And am I the corporate secretary? I will say I would not go to a company where I was not also the corporate secretary. If I was in the general counsel role, that would be a hard no for me.
Got it. And so I would say that kind of makes up the matrix of variables that you would look at with respect to evaluating a particular role if it did not report into the CEO.
And if it does report into the CEO, I would still look at all of those things. I've had people reach out and say, oh, but you're not going to be the corporate secretary. That'll be the CFO. I'm like, I'm out. Won't do it. Because I think that's a really important component of a general counsel role, is their role with the board. And if it also indicates to me a company that may not actually be looking for a GC, they might be looking for a different senior role, but they don't really want the GC role as I perceive it to be.
Yeah,
so
good point. Meg, anything you'd add to that from your perspective and experience?
I think that's a great list, and the opportunity, another question that each of us should be asking, regardless of the role you're interviewing for, is just sort of, what's the scope of the role today, and where do people see it going? Because there can be, you may be going into an earlier stage company where they're like, we really need a lot of help with commercial. But if you can have those conversations with the hiring manager, whether CEO, CFO, someone else, and explain that the value of legal as the company continues to grow and develop is going to grow and develop, and they agree with that, as opposed to saying, no, we really just need somebody who's going to be working on contracts, then it's going to give you a lot of insight into how the role is viewed by the rest of the executive team, by the company as a whole, and whether they understand legal. I agree with Eleanor's comment on being corporate secretary and having board access. I was corporate secretary at one of my companies. I was not at the other one. I was going to do it, but essentially had too much on my plate because of some other initiatives that I was leading. But that one, I was not bothered by not being secretary because the longtime outside corporate counsel was the secretary, and I was present and presenting at every board meeting. So he really was a note taker, and I was the general counsel presence at the board meetings and had the relationship with the board members. Had they told me that I was not going to be invited to board meetings, that would have been a much different situation, a much different conversation.
Got it. Would you consider that somewhat of a dotted line to the board, and does that satisfy kind of the requirements, or is it something more than that?
I think it was a dotted line to the board. Again, our corporate secretary, he really was just, an outside counsel taking the minutes and handling that. It was one fewer thing for me to handle, but I was presenting the board during each board meeting. I was answering their questions, and the outside counsel, and I had an understanding that if a legal question was asked, even if it was directed to him, he should go to me first and look to me and say, you should ask that to Meg. What do you think, Meg? And I had the first, the first response on it. If he needed to speak up, that certainly happened, but it wasn't very often because I was the lawyer who was in the thick of things on the exec team. Thus, it was not a significant problem for me. And as I was building my team and having more bandwidth on my side, I was like, I'll just take that over at some point. Gotcha. It was also my first general counsel job, so I didn't necessarily view the secretary sort of feather in my cap as I do today. My next company, as soon as I was hired, I was like, you have to make me secretary.
Got it. Mark, anything to add there? And then we'll lead off the next question with you as well.
Just a couple of things. Well, first off, I think the corporate secretary, the board interactions, the CEO interactions, if you're not reporting to the CEO, like all of that, those are super critical. But my answer is it depends. I would say it's the reporting structure requires some conversations at any company. I think at some companies, say in regulated spaces like healthcare, fintech, I think it requires probably more conversations and deep and different types of conversations. And frankly, also, if you're in the legal tech space, I think, and that's a different set of considerations than it would be in a regulated space. A B2B SaaS company like Segment, I think also some conversations to have, but it's just different types of conversations.
Yeah, fair point. Well, look, part of this specific or sub-question around the broader question of reporting lines was around CEO versus CFO. And Mark, you have actually reported to a CFO in the past. Let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons, particularly from the lens of your own experience, having reported to both kinds of executives, in terms of what was the difference? What was the feel? Did it hold you back at all reporting to the CFO versus the CEO? And the last kind of piece that I would conversation is, was it better for the company in any fashion to report to the CEO versus the CFO?
It's an important question. The precedential value of my situation is probably none, but I still think I think it's interesting. So like I said, I was the head of legal reporting to the CEO, Peter, who I adore. He's great. He approached me not a few months after our CFO had started. She started after I did, and said, hey, I think I want to make a reporting change and have you report to the CFO, to Sandy. I'm not going to make that change without, your sort of blessing. Can we talk about it? And I was like, sure. Candidly, I'm not excited about this, but I get what you're saying. Let's talk it through. And so over the course of a series of weeks, a month or so, we talked it through. And I knew he was going to make the change. And I was upfront with him. I was like, look, if you make this change, I'm not going to leave the company. At the same time, I do have some concerns. I said, you and I have a good relationship. I want to continue to make sure that we are interacting. I want to continue to make sure that I have authority and permission, so to speak, to go to the board. And then the last piece of it, which was, again, this is where the precedential value comes in. Like Sandy, our CFO, was a recovering lawyer. I adored her. I knew we would work really well together. And we had conversations as well. And she's like, look, you're going to report to me in this situation, but I really view you as my peer and colleague, and that, it will be like, you're going to be running legal. I'm not going to get in, your business and sort of all of that. So like I said, I had some concerns. And by the way, when we made the flip, I told Peter, I said, look, I'm okay with this. It's got to flip back well before we go public. And he said, without hesitation, absolutely. And that gave me a lot of confidence. Peter was, he was and is always just a very direct person. And so like, I knew that there was something I could trust, and I felt comfortable with how things were going to go.
Yeah. There's actually a really relevant question, which I'll throw out to each one of you. And Sharon Lee asked which one, and I think she means between the CEO and the CFO, is best to help set the risk profile of the company. Any thoughts around that?
I'll
Yeah,
start.
Eleanor, please.
I don't look at it that way. I think there's a risk profile of the company often set by the general counsel in consultation with other people, but the company itself will have a tone, right? It'll have we go big or go home, or it'll have maybe if they're in a highly regulated industry, like here is our very clear structure. We do not go outside of those lines. But I think, in my career, even early in career, I was always asked, what did I think the risk profile should be? And what I think they were really asking me wasn't a risk profile. It was, how risky are the things we are doing? And what do you think this looks like if it goes badly? And that's how I approach it today. So I think any one of those people, I would say all of them are best suited. And you want to make sure that the executive staff is aligned, because you might have one executive that has maybe different short-term goals. Maybe they carry a number that is very different from what the general counsel does, and they might be less risk averse, right? So you want to have those conversations. So I'm sorry, I didn't really answer the question because I wanted to reframe it a little.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to have a perspective where that's not necessarily a two-person conversation. And I think that actually kind of leads into the next part of the conversation for us. And Eleanor, I'll start with you because you raised this yesterday in our prep call, which is that right now we're talking about titles and reporting lines, but behind all of those, there are human beings and people. So to what extent should that factor into this analysis for anyone, and how should they go about vetting that conversation?
Well, and this is where it gets a little spicy, because I could start to tease Mark and say, easy for you to say, you're the white guy over 40, and maybe you are perceived
over 50, not over 40.
I just said over 40. You can decide. But my view is, in all seriousness, you do need to think about what is the perception of who you are. Where are you in your career? Does this make you feel less than, right? That's the emotion I see behind I think I'm seeing behind a lot of the comments of, oh, I don't feel valued if I report to someone other than the CEO. And I'm here to say, you may not be valued if you do report to the CEO, or you may be valued more if you report to someone else. And, to my SurveyMonkey example, getting the offer letter and having it report to not the person I thought it would report to. So thinking it was having been told it was the CEO, learning it was the COO. I needed to sort of think about how did I think I would feel when I went in? Would this be something I had to get over? And would it make me feel less than somehow? I decided I was at a point in my career where I was fine with it. If I had been earlier in my career, I don't know that I would have felt the same way. And when I was earlier in my career at a publicly traded company, Niku, I went in as the AGC, or I was hired as the AGC. By the time I got there, the GC was gone. So I reported into the SVP of Worldwide Operations or Worldwide Partnerships. He became the CEO. That's how I ended up, I stuck with him, right? And eventually I became the GC. And then after he was the CEO, he's like, can you please report to the CFO? I was like, no, absolutely not. You can't do that. And then he said, no, I really need you to do it. I was like, okay, I'll do it. But the agreement we had was I would continue to meet with him, the CEO, monthly, He was an ex-venture law group attorney. He knew securities inside and out. I didn't. I needed him for that.
Yeah.
He needed to do less work. He wanted G&A to be less work for him.
Okay.
And so it made sense.
Meg, Mark, anything you'd add to that in terms of the people side of the equation here?
The people side of the equation, you can also, and it's hard if you're coming into a new company, you may not have the visibility, but to the extent that you can pick up on it or think about it or ask the questions to get there to understand like who has the political power. You know, during yesterday's discussion, we were talking about the difference of reporting to a management CEO, a true leader, versus the star, you know, sort of famous person CEO who's not running the company. And you know, looking at the difference between reporting to a startup CFO versus a Sheryl Sandberg level COO. You know, if you're reporting to us, this conversation is really focused on CFO and CEO, but if you look at COO, which is another reporting line that I think is more common, then is the CEO or COO really the person who's running the company or running the day-to-day in the company and has visibility across, you know, has the type of visibility that a general counsel has? And are they going to be a partner because they understand that and they have the political power and the visibility on the company and the understanding of what each of the operational pieces does? That's going to be really different than going into a startup and reporting to a CFO who is only wearing a finance hat. That's important. And I think the political power piece is also just generally something to think about as you're going through your career. I hadn't thought about it yesterday. Today I realized, you know, a good example is one of my first startups. The head of legal was reporting to this, or the head of HR was reporting to the CFO, but he didn't have a lot of political power. And I think I had more of the CEO's ear. So the three of us got together and said, let's put HR under legal, not because HR shouldn't be reporting directly to the CEO, but because HR is not reporting to the CEO. And Meg, as general counsel, has the CEO's ear and is willing to use that to get HR, you know, sort of moving forward in the way we wanted to. And the CFO didn't necessarily have the understanding of HR or the same type of relationship with the CEO at that time as I did. So you can leverage these to sit underneath somebody who the CEO is going to listen to more than they're listening to you at that time. And that can be valuable to you as well.
Mark, anything to add on this one?
I mean, I think Eleanor, you know, she referenced our spicy conversation yesterday, and it was a point that I made the comment yesterday that when I took the job at Segment, I didn't care about the title, and I said it was scoped as a head of legal, properly scoped given the time frame of the company. But one thing that did not enter my mind, and Eleanor appropriately checked me on this yesterday, was like I didn't worry stepping into the company about how I was going to be perceived. And that comes from being at the time a 40 plus white male, now a 50 plus white male. You can't undersell that piece of things. And I do think that that's relevant. And I think both title and who you report to is a part of that, unfortunately.
Yeah, understood. Like Raul in our chat has been in various reporting lines across the C-suite and just made a comment around how much he learned reporting into the CFO. Look, I've also personally been a true believer that it's the person you report to far more than the reporting line from a title perspective. I, like Mark, haven't always cared about the title, and I understand that comes with a level of privilege of just being a man, and so I have to own that. But it does, to some extent, provide a perspective that maybe is not talked about enough, which is what are you going to learn and what are you going to have visibility across? And each of you touched on this as the lead lawyer for the company to actually be able to do your job better. Because I'm sure there are plenty of CEOs out there who are hyper-focused, for example, on the product side of the equation, right? And that brings with it, if it's a heavily regulated industry, it brings with it all kinds of legal and regulatory risk. You want to be cognizant of that. But they're less focused on the other operational aspects of the company, which is probably why the Facebook decision was initially made. for the GC to start reporting into Cheryl. Maybe, maybe not. So it just, I think it's a part of the reaction, which has thrown me for a little bit of a loop, which is like, but what about the people who are behind these roles rather than the roles themselves? So it's nice to hear each of your experiences and thoughts on that. And also to have Raul kind of chime in on our chat, say, I actually learned quite a bit from the CFO, and it set me up very nicely to be a stronger GC, to understand the finances of the company. If you were to do a legal operations survey, for example, across industries right now, one of the top 2 or 3 priorities for legal departments is cost. My role at Facebook when I first joined was actually kind of created by the CFO himself at the time. So there are a lot of operational aspects of this which are growing in terms of need for GCs to have. Is there anything that you would offer up the audience here? And Eleanor, we can start with you around that side of the equation, about needing to be more operational in nature and having more perspective around operational effectiveness as a general counsel or a CLO.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's key for, in my experience, when I went into my first public company GC role, I had no operational experience on the financial side. And I remember my CEO, the same CEO who had been the VLG partner, getting really frustrated with me at a certain point. He said, "You don't understand budgets. You're really not understanding budgets." And I was like, "Look, you got 16 real estate litigations. Like, you've broken these leases." This was the dot-com bust. "What do you want me to do? Like, I can't prevent the litigation from coming in." And he said, "You've just proven you really don't understand budgets." And I said, "Okay, fine. Sit down with me and teach me true budgeting." And he did that. We spent a half hour, and every once in a while I'd mess it up and he'd be like, "Budgets." And that's how I really learned, oh, a big part of being a public company GC is truly understanding, how do you manage a budget, and how do you manage when things are coming in from the side that you can't predict. And one of the things that he said to me, he was pretty hard on me. I appreciate everything he did for me, but he did not mince words with me ever. And he said to me, "You come in here and you think your job is hard, but your job is not as hard as the people who are bringing in revenue. You get to keep your job if you don't bring in whatever you're supposed to do. You have to be pretty egregious to get fired, and they get fired when they miss 1 quarter." And he said, "You need to understand this differently, and you can't be special, and you can't say I'm underwater all the time," which is like a lawyer thing to say, right? And I learned more from that. And I don't know if he was the CEO then or the head of worldwide operations or the CFO. He was all those roles at different times. But I learned how to be a better GC. And if I had reported to the then CEO when I came in initially, he would have taught me nothing. He knew nothing about law. He didn't like lawyers. I was a necessary evil. I would not have been able to develop. And I was at that company. I worked for that person for 8 years at 2 different companies, the one who taught me all this. And it was the best thing that could have ever happened to me in my career. And so I do, when people say, I won't even interview at a role that reports to anybody but the CEO, I always encourage them, no, take the interview and understand the why, because this person might care more about what you're doing than the CEO. You might develop more, and it depends where you are in your career. I didn't know what I was doing. And I was like, I wasn't even 10 years out of law school. I had no idea what I was doing. And he taught me. So I'm forever grateful to him for that, even though it was really, really miserable a lot of the time.
But it stuck with you and it's helped you, and that's what it's all about. I think that's the leadership that he provided. Meg, Mark, anything to add on that front?
I guess what I would say is I mean, the people piece is so important. I look at when I shifted to reporting to Sandy, our CFO, and how that paid dividends down the road, because we built this trust relationship, not just between me and Sandy, but between finance and legal. And there's a bunch of ex-Segment folks on this call listening in. I love that they're here. But like the finance and legal teams were so connected and sort of like got what each other was doing in a way that I don't think would have happened had I continued to report to the CEO. And so by the time we went through an acquisition by Twilio in the middle of COVID, where we were all remote, that trust, and that was a complicated, it wasn't messy, but it was a $3.2 billion acquisition. It was a big, pretty good size acquisition. But the trust that was there, that between me and Sandy and between our teams, really paid dividends in a way that frankly I hadn't really thought about until this conversation.
There's been a few questions around this in the chat, and it actually flows very nicely into the next part of our conversation. Maybe folks saw my outline somewhere. I don't know. I didn't think it was public, but it's flowing very, very nicely. So Meg, we'll start with you because you touched on this a little bit earlier as well. And we talked about this yesterday, and it's a Hamilton reference about being in the room where it happens and having a seat at the table. Now, I think there are at least two viewpoints on this. One is that a reporting line automatically gets you a seat at the table. I don't personally subscribe to that viewpoint. I think you have to earn that seat at the table. But what are your thoughts around that? Because I think we all are going to start from the premise, which I think we all can agree on, which is that you need to have, as the GC, you need to have a seat at that table, at that executive table. If you are directly reporting to the CEO, A, does that automatically guarantee you that seat at the table? If not, why not? And B, if you're not reporting to the CEO, does it not give you, there's a lot of negatives here, does it not give you that seat at the table? And if so, how do you earn that? And if that was a mouthful, I think hopefully you understand what I meant and we can go with it.
I think this goes back to everybody's answer of it depends on a lot of this, but that having a seat at the table and being a member of the executive team is the number one sort of question I would be asking in reviewing a GC job. I had one of my CEOs once, he was like, "You're very busy. Do you want to skip weekly exec meeting?" And I was like, "No, of course not." Like, that is the most important meeting, because even if we're not talking about legal, if product is talking about what they're developing, or sales is talking about challenges they're having, or customer success has a big fight with the customer, whatever it may be, all of that eventually will touch legal, and it all affects legal. And legal, I think Mark yesterday described legal as the connective tissue for the company. And I really liked it, that legal touches across everything. So if you don't have that literal seat at the table in those meetings, it's harder for you to do your job, and you're going to get more siloed into we hired a lawyer to do contracts, and so it becomes a very different situation for you. But yes, you want that voice. And that, I think, leads into also something we talked about yesterday of startups, especially smaller startups, earlier stage startups, we'll see where they'll say, I want to hire a general counsel, I want to hire a head of legal. And that role is being envisioned, is being created to deal with legal headaches today. And the legal headaches today for that company are probably tied to sales deals and vendor deals and commercial work. And so you may see those job listings that are really focused on that. You look and you're like, well, you're hiring a senior commercial lawyer. You're not hiring an executive. And that's something that I look really closely at, because even if you're being hired in that role as reporting to the CEO, if the entire role is, can you review contracts for us? Then you're coming in with the rest of the executive team looking at you as somebody like, oh, they're going to handle the contracts. And maybe during the interview process or during other conversations, you have the conversation of, hey, there's a lot of things that legal can do. And a good general counsel, in my experience, in my opinion, is a business executive first and a lawyer second. So if when you're talking to people and they're interviewing you, they're saying, no, we need a lawyer because we want to cut outside counsel costs, then your experience, regardless of your reporting structure, is going to be so different than if they're like, we need another executive who is legal focused and risk focused and compliance focused, but who is a business person sitting at the table with this other set of executive business people.
Yeah.
There's also, if I can just add to that, there's also a bias, which can be positive or negative, that many other non-lawyers have, that if you're a lawyer sitting in the room, you're going to always lead with law. And I think we do often make that mistake. I know I do at times. And I shared with this group, a very kind peer of mine said, hey, you're in the room because we care about your business mind. Stop telling me about law. I know you know it, and I'm assuming you take care of that behind the scenes. Like, I don't care about law. I care about, she said to me, stop depriving me of your business mind. And it was the kindest conversation, and I walked away thinking, I thought I was leading with business, but the perception of me was I was not. And so the other thing I came away with from that conversation is maybe even when I am leading with business, there's this assumption that I'm going to lead with law. So I maybe have to be even more conscious and rotate a little bit more in how I say things. And that gets back to, if what you're doing is contracts, you shouldn't report to the CEO, probably. Like, why would you report to the CEO?
Yeah.
The CEO has nothing to do with contracts. And so it's elevating that role to, this is a business role. And so you need to know, what are you being hired to do? A business role or a more operational role?
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. Mark?
I hate following Eleanor. She always has such amazing things to say. You do too, Meg. But no, I think that was great feedback that you got in a kind way. Look, when I was talking to Segment about taking the job, I said before I didn't care about title, and I didn't care that much about reporting structure, but it was reporting to the CEO, so I didn't really think about it that much. The one conversation I had with Peter before I took the job was, okay, I don't need to be on the exec team, but it's critical that I'm in the room. And again, he said without hesitation, absolutely, we need you in that room. We need you in the board meetings. We need you in the E-team meetings. And I think the expectation was eventually I would be part of the E-team, and that's how it played out. But yeah, like the connective tissue is one that someone said to me years ago, and it stuck with me. Legal touches so many different, all the parts of the company in a way that nobody else does. Finance doesn't, HR doesn't, marketing doesn't, sales doesn't, legal does. And that's where Eleanor's point about being a business person becomes really important, because you as the GC or the legal team are seeing things in a way and seeing parts of the company that nobody else is seeing. And so again, the legal advice you're going to provide is sort of table stakes, but like where you can really add value to the company is on the business, with your business acumen and your executive presence and all of that, and sort of like helping the company to bring it all together.
Part of the seat at the table, and this is something that's been part of my experience, particularly over the last 12 years since I left my law firm days, there's a perception that builds up around legal from the business, and there's a lot of negativity that can be associated with some of those interactions and things around, you're too much of a lawyer, you need to be more of a business person. Like, that's a pretty common thread that I've experienced in my consulting days, and certainly, in my in-house days as well. What can lawyers really do? And this is probably some specific feedback that we'd like to offer up to the audience, to those who are GCs and aspiring GCs. What are just some of the specific things they can do to earn a seat at that table, irrespective of that perception, or to break through some of that perception? Meg, let's start with you on this one.
I think showing value, we'd say, like, the connective tissue of the company coming through legal is really spoke to me, because you have visibility that no one else in the company has. If you are doing your job well as a general counsel, you are seeing all the way across the company. And if you're having conversations all the way across the company, you're also going to see like where there's high functioning partnership and where there's dysfunction. And I told my team at the last company, I was like, if something touches legal, even if it's like 5% of legal issue, but we can see it's touching a lot of other groups and causing problems there. If we see a solution, let's put that solution forward and like, let's solve that problem for the rest of the company. And it makes legal very popular, because people are like, oh, wait, this was causing headaches for sales and security and IT. And and a little bit for legal, you guys came up with an idea to fix it and just fixed it. Because it's not often a heavy lift to fix these dysfunctions. It's a matter of no one else being able to see how all of the dysfunction is working together or not working together, as the case may be. So that's a really good way to show business acumen, is to just understand where the business is working, where it's not working, and try to solve it. The flip side is, if it didn't touch legal, but we're aware of a problem, then it gives you an opportunity to have conversations with other executives or the full exec team and say, hey guys, it looks like this is really dysfunctional. I have an idea, that we can fix it. You don't want to always bring up problems or say no or make it other people's issue. And that kind of goes to the business acumen of business leaders may identify problems, but then they're not going to present the problem. You're going to present the solutions, the potential solutions, your ideas, and have that conversation. And that gives you a way to show other people kind of what you do. That the what does legal do question is one that is hard for other executives to answer. Other executives will answer it based on what legal does for their team. Sales is going to say legal closes deals, or legal causes friction and slows down sales. Hopefully that's not what they're saying, but some of them will. Product is going to say legal files patents, or whatever engineering. So having a chance to kind of demonstrate where all the silos that legal is working in and bring them together is really valuable in demonstrating your value, and then why the relationships are so important across the full exec team, and why you need that seat at the table, and why maybe the CFO shouldn't have the seat at the table and you are simply getting information secondhand from the CFO or from the COO or whoever it may be. But those direct lines of communication are so important. So talking to people about how you have effectively built lines of communication, and then why those lines of communication are important is a big piece on just simply being successful, regardless of who you're reporting to.
Yeah, great points. Mark, I think you wanted something to say.
So this one is really hard for lawyers, and anybody who's worked with me or knows me knows it was especially hard for me, which is in those early days, the first few months of your new role, regardless of who you report to, really listening, doing a lot more listening than talking. You're in these meetings. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to stay quiet the whole time, but you really need to pick your spots. And I gravitated towards, to Eleanor's earlier point, or different, I gravitated towards the legal stuff and really tried to not weigh in on the business because I didn't feel like, one, I really knew it well enough, or two, that I had credibility yet to really weigh in on the business. And then as I got more comfortable, and this was in the E-team, in board meetings, but also with product teams and more of the tactical meetings, really just listening is huge. Before listening a lot more than you're actually talking, it really helps actually develop credibility that you're and then also how you're going to weigh in. If something comes up, you're like, ooh, that's a legal risk. Do I raise this in the board meeting? Do I raise it in the ET? No, I probably don't. I probably have a side conversation, or maybe I'm slacking with the CEO in the middle of the meeting. But sort of it's what you raise and how you raise it and when you raise it can really actually help in developing your sort of exec business presence in throughout the company.
Well, and to add that too, I think there's general counsel who have really, I think all of us probably have really strong opinions on matters, but there are very few matters that legal should have the final say on. There are a few ethical issues that you have to take to the board because it's obligatory, but other than that, decisions are business decisions, and legal weighs in on risk and other concerns. But being able to tell the rest of the exec team, I'll give you my honest opinion no matter what it is, but once we as a group or the CEO as an individual make a decision, I'm 100% behind it, is very important as well.
Yeah.
And that's going to give you credibility of, I will share my opinion as everyone should, and then we're all going to get in line and move together.
One of the things you can do in those moments, so you talked about having a seat at the table, and I think about, yes, it's about having a seat at the table, but how do you keep that seat? And which table is it? Are there other tables that are now being developed because they are like, oh, we don't want those people who kind of get in our way. And now we're going to have these smaller conversations. The way I think about it is, to Mark's point of watching a lot of what does the company value and how do other departments communicate? A, communicate, and B, communicate their value. So is it in metrics? Legal never seems to have metrics unless they have legal operations, right? And most departments have metrics. If you want to keep your seat at the table, you've got to have some metrics too. You've got to show that you know how to run whatever the business is you run within the larger business. And I think that can help you speak differently and look at the bigger business goal. I did a exercise with my team once, and I said, I want you to not use the word risk with anybody outside the legal department for a period of time. You pick the period of time because they don't care. They want your opinion.
Yeah.
Don't talk about risk. You've now given them a job. Talk about what you think should happen and what it looks like if it goes well and what it looks like if you're wrong, because you're wrong some large percentage of the time, probably. We all are, because we're just guessing what's going to happen next. And I think remembering that that's how most people work. They don't talk about risk all the time. They talk about, should I do this or should I not do this? And what happens if I do it or I don't do it? That helps you keep your seat at the table, I think. And Mark was saying, listening and talking more in the legal parts, that is exactly what I was doing or thought I was doing. And I waited too long, I think, to sort of start putting in, like, I had thoughts, but I wasn't sharing them in the room. I was sharing them outside of the room. And that was the other thing the person said to me is, no, now there's a meeting after the meeting. Share it in the meeting. So it was great advice. Hard to hear in the moment and really great advice.
I think, no surprise that if you think, speak, advise from the business side first and lead from that, then you're going to automatically keep that seat at the table as well, because that's how the business thinks and walks and talks. There's been an interesting set of questions around titles of the GC. So I'll just throw a few out there and get the group's perspective on it for the audience. There's the head of legal, there's the general counsel, and there's the chief legal officer. Eleanor, I saw that you had responded to you. They're essentially the same thing. It really,
No,
they're not the same thing.
I said they can be.
Got it. Yeah, let's dive into that real quick.
Yeah, that's a very different answer. I think they can be used interchangeably. My question, so I have a general counsel title now. I've had a CLO, my last job was a CLO. Job before that was also a CLO. The question that I had with this is, why is the title general counsel? And do you ever plan to hire above a general counsel? And the answer was no, no one will ever be hired above you. You are the head of the whole legal organization, period, end of story. Could they hire above me? Of course they could, but they could, even if my title was CLO, right? They could just move me over. But so I think it's understanding why the company uses that title. What they would have preferred I had was a head of legal. And I said, no, I'm not comfortable with that, because I do think a head of legal often indicates a different type of role. And when I came into my current role, I knew I was coming in as part of the team to take the company public. And I said, a general counsel is really what you need. At a minimum, you've got to be called the general counsel, I think, when you go public. But I think if you go on our website, it might even say head of legal. I don't know. I also pointed out to them, there's somebody else who had the head of legal title in my department. So that would have been a little awkward.
Yeah.
And I said, I don't want to take his title away. He can still be head of legal and I'll be the general counsel. So, but back to, it's easy for me to say at this stage in my career, when I held a lot of different roles. If it was my first general counsel role, never in a million years would I be okay with head of legal.
Yeah.
And I've given advice to people is get the most senior title that is appropriate for that company.
Yeah.
But make sure you know if someone can be hired or if they're planning to hire someone above you.
Yeah. Okay. Mark or Meg, any thoughts around the title issue for the role itself?
So I agree with usual what Eleanor said. I think when I went in the segment, I didn't care about the title. I actually did care about the title. I cared about the path to general counsel. It was, as I said, appropriately scoped as a head of legal role. And then we talked, and in that conversation in the hiring, we talked about things like, in the context of a double trigger, whether I would get hired over. It was like this. So I do think that the title is important from that perspective. Like, what does it say about the scope of the role? Sorry, I'm just repeating in a less eloquent way.
There's also, you'll have visibility of the rest of the exec team. If every executive is vice president of legal, vice president of HR, vice president of finance, and there is a CEO, it's a very different situation than if everyone has like a chief of role and they're asking to hire you as head of legal.
Yeah.
Then that is going to signal to the company that you're not as important as other people. It's harder to kind of crawl out of that hole than it is if everybody is a VP of whatever.
There's someone who just asked that question, Meg, of how do you get back if that happens?
Well, how do you get back once if you're I mean,
if you lose the seat?
It's hard to get the seat back if you lose the seat. But as with everything, I think as with gaining the seat, if you come in and you maybe don't have the seat because it's your first role and you're coming in as that head of legal, which to be clear is a reasonable path for folks. Like, this is not to knock the people out there who have their first sort of GC level role and they're heads of legal and maybe they're really focused on commercial. That's awesome. But think about what comes next. And as with that pathway, if you've lost your seat, it's demonstrating value outside of just contracts, outside of just whatever they're telling you to do, demonstrating business acumen and value as a business executive, not just as a lawyer doing legal work.
I think one thing about, so I was going to say about Julian's question, because I would try to view it not so binary. Like, you're probably not going to get the seat back at the table in the way you're not going to get back to reporting to the CEO. But I think a conversation with the CEO about being in the room with E-team so you can be their strategic advisor, it may not be exactly what you want, but it will help you get much closer to being able to provide the advice the company needs than if you're not in the room at all.
Right. If everything is getting filtered through another executive or simply not making it to you, it's going to make it really hard to do your job and to add the value that you can add to the company. So explaining that being present, even if you're present and quiet and listening to the executive meetings, is very valuable to the company as a whole.
I think, and Meg, you brought up a really good point of it can be part of your career ladder, right? Maybe you're earlier in career and you're really trying to get that first big GC job, which might mean revenue or public versus private. Big GC job can mean a lot of different things. You, not you, Meg, but you, anybody. But I think thinking about where are you in your career and how does that relate to your title? And then, of course, how does your title relate to your compensation and what your ladder is really important. The person who was talking about being removed, one of the downsides I did see at SurveyMonkey was I didn't report into the CEO, and then our CEO passed away. And the board looked at the reporting structure to understand where they thought people sat in the organization in terms of relevance for various meetings. And I remember I came back in and said, no, that the reporting structure is not a reflection of relevance or importance. It was a reflection of Dave's preferences because he's what I would have called the celebrity CEO. So he had 2 direct reports, actually 3. One was our head of marketing, who even traveled with him, right? That was his big role, was being out. And then the president, and then the COO. And that was it. And everybody else reported up to the president and the COO. So after he passed, it was confusing. And that was sort of a knock-on effect I hadn't expected.
Yeah. We are pretty much at time. And I'd like to kind of recap what I think were some of the highlights I heard through the course of this conversation, particularly around the question of reporting into a CEO and or reporting into someone other than the CEO in the C-suite. And I think some of the takeaways for folks who are in the situation, or as I think some of the polls have shown, and I think some of the data has shown that's been collected now, the reality is folks are going to be reporting into executives other than the CEO as the lead lawyer. So it's a reality that many will have to face. Some of the highlights that we covered today. One, make sure that you can get a sense for the people behind the roles. Number two, rather than just the reporting line itself. Number two, can you ascertain, if you're applying for this job, can you ascertain through the scope of the role whether you're actually going to have a seat at the table? Even if it's scoped that way and it feels that way, you're still going to have to do things to earn and keep your seat at the table. Anything that the three of you would add to those variables in terms of setting yourself up for a role that's successful and that you're enjoying? And then we'll wrap up.
Reality is a really important thing here. Like, we can talk about that it would be much better for the GC or CLO to report to the CEO, but reality is that a lot of folks aren't viewing it that way. And how do you navigate that with it? Sure, try to change it, maybe, but if you can't, like, are you going to take yourself out altogether? And I would just caution folks against doing that.
I'm going to double down on that. If you're asked to interview for a job that doesn't report to the CEO, interview. Even though you feel really, really strongly about it, you might learn something even from the interview, or they might learn something. And even if you decide, you know what, that role's not going to be for me because I won't feel valued, or I won't have a seat at the table or be in the room, those conversations are good for you. You meet people, you learn a lot, people know who you are, and maybe the next time there's a role that does report to the CEO, they remember you. So I think it's worth taking the interview. And how much do you want the job? I wanted that SurveyMonkey job. So I was able to feel fine with it, and it ended up being absolutely fine. It had some weird components to it, but it was fine. And I really, really liked the person that I reported to, and all of GNA reported up to him. I wasn't alone. So remembering where you are and where you want to go, that's what I would say.
Meg?
Eleanor is too eloquent on that. I agree with everything she said. Yeah, just be deliberate, and also be open, because you never know. Like, you take those calls, you have the conversation. Maybe it's not the job for you, but it's the job for your mentee who's just awesome, or your former colleague who's great, and you can refer them in, and then you've helped them, you've helped a company, and you've built your relationships and gleaned some new knowledge about how other folks think about things, and maybe educated them along the way.
Yeah. Well, thank you three so much. I've actually learned quite a bit as well. And as somebody who may or may not have a GC reporting into him at some point in the future, you've given me a lot to think about in terms of how I communicate the role and the scope to that person if it ends up reporting into me. So thank you. Shai, back over to you.
All right, thanks Akshay, and thanks to our wonderful panel. I want to recap the polls real quick, really interesting findings. So 91% of our audience says the GCs should report to the CEO, which is, among the highest poll results we've ever seen. GCs who do you report to? 55% say the CEO, 23% say the CFO, 12% the COO, and other is 10%. So really interesting findings there. One more question I saw in the chat, and folks, if you enjoyed the program, let our panel know. And it was a fantastic discussion. Somebody asked about attorney-client privilege. Is that a concern at all if you're reporting to the CEO, I guess let's discuss that. Is there any considerations? Is that a concern? How do you handle that?
I don't think it's a problem with your reporting structure. I think what I'm guessing the comment was about is if you report to someone other than the CEO and that person is communicating your thoughts to others, do you lose the privilege? And the answer is probably yes. I mean, so you would need to make sure people understand how the privilege works, and that you have that direct communication with whomever needs to hear from you.
Okay. All right. Great. All right. We'll wrap up here. Thank you, Eleanor, Meg, Mark, and Akshay. Thank you, SpotDraft, for sponsoring this wonderful webinar and discussion. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. It was wonderful. We'll break here. Happy Wednesday to all. And for all my LA people out there, I hope to see you tomorrow night at the IHC Mixer.